Thank you all so much. I really appreciate so many people showing up for this. Um, I was talking uh, to Danielle before we got started here, and I heard that like 250 people registered for this. So I am so excited that so many people have an interest in this topic, and hopefully I can do it some justice for you today. Um, what I'd like to do is just quickly introduce myself. So my name is Chris. I am the a regional representative on the board of directors for NASW Michigan. I use he, him pronouns. I currently work as a home-based therapist with Easter Seals Mork in Flint, Michigan, and also do some contract therapy in a private practice clinic in Bay City. Um, so kind of do clinical work. My background is in macro social work, doing community organizing, activism, some policy analysis work as well. So that's a little bit about me. Just making sure that we acknowledge land today, specifically for me here in Michigan and where I'm at. Um, so for today, here's what I kind of have outlined for us. So what I'd like to start with is just going through and kind of giving an overview of what is mutual aid. It's maybe a term that we've heard of, maybe a term that we've used. I want to make sure that we're all kind of on the same page in terms of what we're thinking when we talk about mutual aid. And so I also want to walk through some examples. I have some historical examples to kind of talk through, some contemporary examples, and then some everyday examples as well, because I think it's important that we're able to kind of think about this in a manageable way. I think a lot of people, the critique of doing more macro-oriented work in social work is that it seems untenable or unfeasible or too big. And so I want to kind of challenge that idea that doing any kind of macro work, organizing work, activism work, systemic work is too big because we all have the skills to be able to do that. And I just want to kind of invite people to think more intentionally about what that can look like for them, particularly within the context of what we're talking about today with mutual aid. Next thing I'd like to kind of go through is just looking at how social work aligns with mutual aid in terms of values and practices and some of those key ideals. I also want to kind of outline some abolitionist perspectives in social work that I think align really well with mutual aid goals and think about what we need to do as social workers to be able to um, do this kind of work. Because I think a lot of times we get stuck in not doing it and we have excuses, and there's some historical precedent, historical context that we have to overcome to be able to even imagine what doing this kind of work might look like. So part of what I hope for today is that we're able to visualize some possibilities for social work in mutual aid spaces, or how we can integrate mutual aid ideals into our own practice so that we are being more intentional within, I think, particularly within our current contemporary political space, because it's one of the more challenging spaces that at least I've experienced in my lifetime as a professional, and has the potential to get much more difficult and much harder. And so I want to make sure that we at least have some vision for how we can move forward in an effective way. Um, some of the goals for today, just to define and describe mutual aid, to describe and discuss the alignment between social work and mutual aid, and then to articulate potential roles for social workers in contributing to mutual aid efforts, or the kind of the vice versa of that, with how can social work integrate mutual aid principles into our own practices. So where I'm going to start is I'm just going to kind of dive into it. If you all have particular expectations, questions as we go through some of this, feel free to mute yourself, interrupt, throw stuff in the chat. I'm going to try to monitor the chat the best I can. Sometimes you'll find that I can get on a soapbox and can just get going. So um, my ADHD is a little challenging in trying to monitor what's on my screen, what's on the chat. So I'll do my best. But if you want to just go ahead and interrupt, please, by all means, feel free to do so. Um, all right. So where I'm going to start, just let's talk about what is mutual aid. And so when I think about mutual aid, I think about like it's a more community-oriented, collective-oriented approach to providing support, particularly within the context of when we have failing governmental systems, where the governmental systems are the source of the problem, or those government supports that we have come to rely on, whether that be us ourselves or the families and communities that we're working with, are being cut or eliminated by the federal and or state authorities. And so Dean Spade, who I will draw from quite a bit today, describes mutual aid as radical acts of caring that are rooted in the shared understanding that systems that are in place are unjust and they create the crises that they claim to address. And I think that's an important principle, kind of, or assumption for us to recognize is that these systems function in particular ways, and those particular ways often mean to maintain the status quo. They don't mean to advance, they don't mean to uplift, they mean to maintain. And I think that's one of those things as social workers that we need to make sure that we're acknowledging because we are a part of those systems. And so again, important for us to at least have some awareness of what our role uh, ends up being oftentimes. Mutual aid also offers strategies for not only addressing immediate survival needs of those people who are right in front of us, who are sitting in our office, but also there's a focus on building solidarity and challenging those power structures that perpetuate inequality or those systems that lead to um, people being in front of us, right? Like we have to be able to work downriver and upriver, um, as we often talk about in social work. And I think that's an important part of what mutual aid is able to do as well, at least in principle. Um, Mutual aid typically looks like grassroots efforts, community helping community. So they are collective efforts that are not only essential for survival of individuals and families within communities, but they also address broader social transformation, particularly in the face of systemic injustice and crises. And I would argue that part of the context for having today's discussion is that we are in a time where we're facing systemic, massive systemic injustice and massive systemic crises, wherein people aren't able to even access basic needs to be able to survive. Um, and so mutual aid offers a means for addressing those crises and inequalities by directly meeting the needs of individuals rather than relying solely on the state or on those governmental systems or the charity structures that are in place. Mutual aid is often characterized by terms like autonomy, solidarity, inclusivity, and also a horizontal organization or power structure. A goal is to foster a sense of collective responsibility and shared decision making. So rather than mimicking kind of the top-down hierarchical hegemonic structures that we often see in our governmental systems, is aimed at taking a more grassroots bottom-up approach with horizontal organization and shared power. Um, Mutual aid tends to prioritize the needs of oppressed and marginalized groups, and tends to work towards creating a more just world, which I would argue is also part of what we do as social workers, right? Like part of why we got into social work. I would guess for at least most of us is that we wanted to be a part of change. We wanted to be a part of helping people meet their needs. We wanted to live those ideals that are outlined in our code of ethics. Um, as I, as I said earlier, mutual aid works to build solidarity, to create alternatives to governmental systems, to charity systems, and really intentionally challenges the power structures that perpetuate hegemonic norms or inequality. Mutual aid efforts advocate for grassroots solutions that address systemic issues rather than top-down hierarchical change models. And mutual aid efforts also expose the limitations and the failures of the systems that we currently have and of the systems that we tend to rely on, which include government support, state support, as well as charity societies or charity organizations. Mutual aid organizations or efforts have deep roots in Black, Indigenous, and immigrant communities. Um, they are acts of resilience and defiance that are practiced out of not only need and necessity in the face of uh, unequal access, but also as a means of transforming systems of power. Um, because part of what mutual aid does is it creates a means for developing a better analysis of the conditions that people are living in, and works to build community capacity for sustained action in meeting the basic needs of those within the community. Historic examples. Um, I think for me, my brain goes immediately to the Black Panthers and some of the programs that they had. So, just as an example, excuse me, their free food program or their free breakfast program, as well as their free health clinic. Um, I think those are very concrete examples of what mutual aid, community mutual aid can look like. I also think of like the Depression era cooperative organizations, um, and the mutualista societies that are have been primarily rooted in Texas and the Southwest United States. Um, when we think of contemporary mutual aid, um, I kind of go to immediately to like land return movements or the land back movements. I also think about worker co-ops, immigrant co-ops, and worker self-directed nonprofit organizations where community is the driving force, where workers are the driving force. Um, in working to kind of uproot um, those traditional power structures as a means of actually being able to get needs met. Um, and I also think it's important to highlight what mutual aid can look like in a very everyday part. Um, of our life because, like I said, people kind of get stuck sometimes when they think about making these big wholesale change efforts. Like they're too big and all of that, but they're not. Like they can be every day. Some of those examples, just sharing knowledge, making sure like we all have things that we know a lot about. We all have skills, we all have resources, we all have things that we can bring to bear in our communities, in our families, in whatever spaces that we're in. And so sharing that information can be a form of mutual aid. I also think about things like establishing like neighborhood exchanges, whether that's like communal yard sales or some kind of transactional interactions within communities or within neighborhoods. I also think about things like community meal trains. Um, yeah, I love what's going on in the chats too. In the chat, sorry. Um, Trying to keep up with that. I also, one of the things that kind of struck me too when I think about like everyday, like neighborhood carpooling. I don't know about you all, but one of the things that our neighborhood does is like rides um, like to precincts to vote and organizing things like that. I think those things are important to do. And then another one I think of, I don't know if you all have a lot of these in your neighborhood, but my neighborhood is like littered with these. I won't say littered because that's got a negative connotation, but there's a lot of like little free libraries and community book exchanges that happen in my neighborhood, and I love it. Like every time I go to the Y, like there's a little free library outside of there, and we try to participate in that as much as possible. Just because, again, sharing knowledge, sharing resources, sharing what we have available to us kind of is the spirit of mutual aid. Um, And so I think that those aren't all the examples. I think there are all kinds of examples. I would imagine that all of us participate in some kind of mutual aid something within our lives, whether we call it that or give that name to it or not. I think we all participate in those programs that are working to help improve our neighborhoods, improve our communities, improve our families, improve our work organizations, and then trying to contribute in a way that works kind of outside of the system, works to meet a need that isn't being met by whatever systems exist. Um, so, some context. I don't know if you all are aware of what's happening in the world. I would imagine that we're all aware of what's happening in the world because it affects us every day in our personal lives, in our work lives. We all are impacted by failing governmental systems. We're all impacted by um, uh, the elimination or threat of elimination or cut from funding from the state and from the federal government. Um, and even looking at traditional supports beyond governmental systems, things like charity organizations, they're all overburdened, they're all underfunded, with funding being cut by the day, it seems like. Um, and another limitation, just to highlight, is that all of the governmental systems and all of the charity organizations, they all maintain some kind of qualifying or exclusionary criteria for access, right? So really perpetuating this idea of um, you need to be deserving of support. You need to be deserving of help. And if we look historically within social work, that's something that we have perpetuated. Whether that's in policy or whether that's in practice, we all have this context of like the deserving poor. And so those are things as social workers that we have to own about our history, and understand that this is still being played out in society. Um, and I know we all know some of the consequences of failing systems because we live those every day. Whether that's with the individuals and families and organizations that you work with, or whether that's in your own daily life, our own daily lives. But we see like restricted or reduced access to being able to get means of survival. We have increased family separation. We have increased risk of health crises, decreased risk of access to health care, increased risk of homelessness, decreased availability of mental health supports. We have increased infrastructure instability. We have increased economic destabilization. And again, kind of this perpetuation of models of deservingness that are being played out every day. And all of these affect the work that we do. All of these affect the families and individuals and communities that we work with and work in. And so my challenge then is to look at the social work context here, right? And so looking at how does social work align with, I would call a mutual aid or community care model, a more idealistic model, because we're looking at challenging power structures that perpetuate oppression, right? And so theoretically, that aligns really well with social work through our professional values, through our ethical responsibilities, through the theoretical grounding that we have in uh, systems theory, and through the skills that we develop in our education and in our practice. I always use the Liam Neeson joke that we have a particular set of skills, right? And I would argue that that particular set of skills that we have um, very much makes us available to do this mutual aid kind of work. So, and more specifically, just looking at like how this is just again my perspective on how I view social work as aligning really well with mutual aid models. Um, so our primary goals as social workers are to help people and to address social problems. We're supposed to challenge social injustice. We're supposed to respect the inherent dignity and worth of the person. We're supposed to recognize the central importance of human relationships. We're supposed to work within and across micro, meso, and macro systems. And again, we have a particular set of skills to work with individuals, families, groups, and communities that can make us effective in doing this kind of mutual aid community care work. Yet, social work is amazingly quiet on a lot of these fronts. That we continually perpetuate kind of these colonized, hegemonic systems of power within our practice, that we tend to become socialized by the hegemony that we claim to fight against, and can often become blinded um, to issues of that hegemonic, power-oriented culture within our own profession, that we don't tend to recognize our own history, and by not recognizing our own history, that we don't have the capacity uh, to redress those problems in an effective way, and that we remain largely silent as revolutionary social movements unfold. And I will caveat that to say that we sometimes will jump in to appropriate some of the ideas from revolutionary moments, or to do that in kind of a performative way. But we don't tend to be super supportive as a profession of big revolutionary social change. Um, More historical context for our profession, that historically we've relied on authority and power, that we've lacked real dedication to radical change and structural transformation, that we tend to um, perpetuate or be a part of systems that perpetuate the status quo. I think one of my favorite story, I won't say favorite, but one of the clearest ways that I try to highlight this when I was teaching with my policy class, I would always on the first day ask students how many of them were excited to be change agents, to be a part of some big social change. And all the hands go up. Like we all want to feel a part of this. And then I ask, how many of us want to work in systems that perpetuate oppression and control? Not as many hands go up, right? And I think that's one of those things that we can sometimes be blinded by, that we're kind of socialized into kind of talking the talk, but not walking the walk. That we have um, an idealistic belief in our values and an idealistic belief in our ethical responsibilities, but we don't necessarily know what that looks like in practice. And so I think we just kind of get blinded by it sometimes. Um, and historically, I think we have not necessarily been supportive of social movements, and we have tended to co-opt some of the ideas and methods and victories of social movements, or to engage in performative ways. Like the example I tend to think of is like um, professional organizations in social work would use like hashtag Black Lives Matter around George Floyd protests, but then also continue to participate in the family policing system and working with law enforcement. And so I think there's some hypocrisy that happens that we need to own and take responsibility for to be able to move forward. Um, And like I said, there's kind of an extensive history of complicity with social control systems like the child welfare system and law enforcement. Um, Again, not to beat a dead horse, but I think it's important that we recognize the context that we're working in, that social work historically has upheld and justified white supremacy and deficit-based thinking. I'm thinking about like charity organization societies from our history, um, tended to be associated with very um, specific religious orientations that we have practiced in segregative, anti-native, and decidedly religious ways. Um, Having, even now, having so many of our supports and services delivered through religious-oriented nonprofit organizations, right? Um, that we continue to um, maintain these heavily patriarchal systems that we tend to ride on the coattails of, or historically have ridden on the coattails of psychiatry, psychology, that very much follow medical models, right? Where we treat people as the problem, rather than treating the problem as the problem. And so I think like these are just some truths and some history that we have to take responsibility for if we're going to move forward. And I think that mutual aid offers a way for us to move forward in a more, I don't know, I tend to be, and maybe this is kind of a reflection of my own privilege, but I tend to be very idealistic. Like I want social work to be so much better than we are. Like I know that we can do it. I know that we have the wherewithal to do it. I know that we have the capacity to do it. Or I hope, I'll say that. I hope that we have the capacity to do it. Um, because our profession tends to stall in moving social justice, those social justice ideals into action, right? Like again, we are really good at talking the talk. Like our code of ethics is fantastic and sounds great. What does that look like in practice? So we sometimes can talk the talk, but not really walk the walk as much. And so I think that that's what we really need to be able to do more effectively. And unfortunately, we see that social workers are historically not really involved in large social movements for change, that they're not as, yeah, yeah, Bonnie, I think that's absolutely right. Um, And that even within social work, we've seen a decline of activism within the field, with social workers spending less than 2% of their time engaging in macro-oriented practices. And that's just not good enough. I mean, it's not. Um, I hate to be that person uh, that says social workers need to do more, need to do better when we know how hard we work. We know the difficulty with the jobs that we have. We know the challenges, and we have to be better. And I think that's about taking accountability, taking responsibility. Yeah, Unfaithful Angels um, is absolutely a recommended read. Um, and when I think about creating frameworks for social work to move forward, for social work to be able to really contribute in mutual aid spaces. Here are just some thoughts that I've had. That activism has to be more of the norm. That we cannot continue to remain silent. Um, that we can't like that's my frustration. It's that idea social work has been so quiet that we can't do that anymore. That we have to call for a reawakening of our profession and a radical confrontation of the hegemonic norms and the patriarchal norms within our own profession. That we have to be willing to commit to dismantling all systems of oppression, not just those that maybe don't directly affect us, right? That we must work compassionately to support each other in this kind of movement. Um, and that doing this kind of work really demands engagement and solidarity and working towards our own liberation as well. That we have to build a healthy culture of resistance, accountability, and consider sustainability in that. So when I think about what that looks like and what that means, a lot of that's just shifting the narrative of social work. So rather than continuing to problematize um, marginalized communities, oppressed communities, um, why don't we increase the focus on the resistance to change, things like privilege and structural barriers to change, rather than problematizing whole groups of people or whole communities of people. Um, that we have to be willing to increase our own bravery about challenging institutions that reinforce oppression, that we have to be willing to call out and be willing to call people in um, when we're perpetuating uh, oppressive practices. Um, I think we have to shift away from kind of this voyeuristic view of communities of color and actually do the work, meet people where they're at, be in the space, um, and not just look from afar and talk about those people, right? Like that tends to be how I kind of think of social work sometimes. Like it's great to talk the talk, but we've got to walk the walk. Yeah. I think I'll just leave it there. Like I could go off on a whole soapbox with that, but I'll kind of leave that there. And we have to turn our focus inward to really evaluate how we individually and how we within our organizations, within our own spaces, how we're showing up for the work. What does that look like for us? And how can we transform that? Um, and I would argue, at least some places to start could be needing to get more involved in policy work and more involved in macro practice, despite any preconceptions of it being something that's too big to tackle or too big for us to do or not having the time to do it. I know that we all work hard and that our time is precious and that we all experience stress and burnout. Uh, Absolutely, Bonnie. Um, and it's just something that we have to normalize. That we also need to work towards unlearning the normalization of our immutability, and avoid colluding with systems of dominance. Um, like that's just something that we have to be intentional about doing. And we need to overtly challenge that false dichotomy between micro practice and macro practice. Like it's social work and it involves both and. Um, okay. So what I'd like to do now, I feel like I've been on my soapbox for the last 35 minutes, just kind of going here. So I want to kind of open it up a little bit and see uh, kind of what you all are thinking. What have you kind of heard that kind of sits well with you, doesn't sit well with you? What are you thinking right now? And as a means of kind of inviting more discussion, I've put a question up here that you can use as a jumping off point. And so any comments in chat or feel free to unmute yourselves. I'd like to spend the next little bit just having some discussion about what this can look like for us as social workers.
Hello. I'll
Yeah.
open my camera. Hi, my name is Erica Jacobson, and I am in South Dakota. Thank you for presenting on this topic. It's really timely for me. I have just recently learned a lot about mutual aid networks and really have been interested in the topic. And I've been part of, I put it in the chat, kind of a grassroots organization is just kind of getting started called SWIM. That's really a mutual support network for social workers to help other social workers. Um, and I think some of the things that I've noticed is um, it's really hard for people who are new to this concept to understand that it's not just charity. You know, I'm not just like volunteering my time. It's really this understanding that we're going to help each other, like this is an exchange. So, it's not like it's supposed to be we're on the same playing field, not like a power dynamic sort of thing. Um, and also, I think as social workers, one of the challenges I've noticed is, especially for us participating in mutual aid, is we're always so used to taking care of other people that it's really a vulnerable place to ask for help from others and being willing to receive that and be in that vulnerable place. But I think that's important for us to try to practice doing that, um, so that we model that for our clients and show them how this kind of model or resource can work. I'm not sure if that is getting at the question you're asking. I apologize if it's not, but those are just my
No,
thoughts.
I appreciate it, and I'm just looking for conversation, and people's thoughts. So, yeah, check out that organization for sure. And I see Lindsay, you have your hand up.
But I love the open discussion going on. I just oh um wait change the clip. Okay. So I was just thinking about how important it is, thank you, for to challenge that dichotomy, like you said, between micro and macro, because like I often forget that the micro really does inform the macro. So the values that I want to see in a larger society can start with just how I interact with my advisor or how I interact with my clients, just that like culture that I'm creating. Yeah, I just think it does feel so big, and a lot of my fellow social workers feel that way, that like I'm not doing anything. I'm not a change agent here, but just using those basic skills we have of educating and helping people challenge like some of their assumptions that are very harmful. These are skills we have, and these are skills that I think support dismantling that hegemonic mentality and supporting these needed shifts. Sorry, it's really loud where I'm at, but I wanted to share. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. And Heidi,
Hi, yeah, I also want to say thank you for putting this together. This is really awesome. But kind of going off of what she was just saying about like creating kind of the culture, I think it's like really important to like, meet your clients where you're at and listen to their lived experience instead of like having this cut and dry method that we always approach everything with. Like every person is going to have a different experience and a different like space and a sense of like intersectionality and just all of those things. So it's really important to use that lived experience and kind of get somebody into a position of power that cares about those lived experiences as opposed to the norms that have been in existence for way too long.
yeah, absolutely. And I think that's why social workers are in such a powerful position to be able to contribute, right? Because we are in those spaces, we hear those stories, we hear about what people are experiencing, so we can be conduits for change and being able to use our position to leverage change efforts. So I think those are such good points.
Absolutely. I think it's super awesome too to hear. I'm in master's school right now, so I think it's super awesome to hear like the just kind of like about the next steps, I guess, and to be able to hear about more of the macro perspective right now. I was working in homeless services too, so to understand like just
Mhm.
how you can use that experience to make more change and be more of an active agent in change as opposed to like you said, talking the talk. So that's awesome.
Yep, great, cool. Teresa,
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, great. I just wanted to really tune in on your talking about going from clinical micro to macro. And I've worked in the schools, school social worker, but seeing bullying and then seeing the mandates coming down about Common Core and about, just the inappropriate developmental standards. So for myself, I went from seeing kids individually to trying to change the system within the school to then going to trying to change legislation. And I actually ran for state representative and was able to serve one term primarily to change the system. It's you can really feel down about it, but you can just make small steps. Even if you can make small steps or raise awareness, I can see how that easily flows as you gain awareness of the system.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Anyone else? I love what's going on in the chat. I have not been able to keep up at all, but I appreciate so much activity. And I'm so glad that so many people were able to join us today. Like it's really exciting.
If I can contribute, I think a form of social work or mutual aid in amongst social workers I would love to see is like a greater sharing of knowledge and resources among social workers in the sense of like we pay for supervision, we pay for trainings, we pay for like for so many things to maintain our profession. And on the one hand, I want everyone to get with like to be paid for their time or to like be compensated for their education. And like I think that's important. But like also that's important in theory, but I also think that's part of us playing into the system.
Mhm.
Um, and um, and so for me, I would like I would love more both to offer and to receive just more forms of like um, sharing knowledge, sharing resources, being like, let's facilitate group work. What I mentioned in the chat, like maybe it's group work to some extent where like people, it's more financially accessible. I take a little bit less from it. Like if I still need that compensation, but it's just more collective, and that we just are willing to support each other as colleagues rather than like like well like getting our due because that's what capitalism tells us we need, and that's what we sometimes need. I get that. um but if I don't have to pay for supervision, I also then don't have to charge for supervision.
Right.
um and so thinking of things that way. um and yeah, I think also just like more group healing in general. I mentioned it again in the chat because I just think it also puts focus on people as how we in the community as mutually healing each other versus like I am the expert in the room healing someone. Like that's not my mentality anyway, but like um if we how we do group work, there's just more peer and mutual aid, and it makes connections, and it just furthers the line. And I just think that's where I see mutual aid and social work
Absolutely.
really coming or thriving.
Absolutely. Lindsay. You're still muted.
Thanks. Hello again. I am just like in awe of our skills as social workers though. Like we really have the ability, like think about with our clients, right? Like when we are trying to work with them on a stuck belief that they've had their whole lives. Like we work some magic sometimes. I think we have such a skill of both de-escalating but also kind of like breaking down these walls so we can have these vulnerable conversations. It's just so much harder to do it when it's like with a congressperson or with somebody who really supports that opposite ideology of yours. But like we really, if we can, for me, I guess I don't want to speak for everybody, but like I have to compartmentalize my experience with others so I can tap into that like social change agent with others, even with my own family who don't fully grasp the impact in like specifically when a lot of federal workers are being laid off. Like my family is pretty liberal, but they're from an older time, and like they just didn't really understand some core aspects that I shed some light on, but I couldn't, just like with a client where I wouldn't be like just challenging right away. I had to kind of meet them where they were at, and then ease them into considering a different idea. Like that paradigm shift happened easier by just kind of doing it in this way. And then the last thing I'll share is I was actually like randomly learning about the Black Panther Party doing those like feeding programs, and what the author, what they were referencing that as an example of like the Black Panther Party was using that as a way to get like a community need met, but to also connect with community members on something they all agreed on. Like they didn't, the people they served and helped didn't necessarily agree with all the ideals of the Black Panther Party, but they all agreed. That I think is getting the foot in the door for activism. It's just where do we agree? And a lot of times I think we agree more than we think. We are just doing it in different ways. So that brings me hope, and I just wanted to share that hope with others.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah. Sarah's question in the chat, I think, thoughts on how we should work to challenge social workers who voted for this administration and or support systems of oppression explicitly rather than implicitly. I feel like that's a huge question, right? I don't know that I have, like, other than this idea of using the skill set we have as social workers and meeting them where they're at, right? And I think that part of what we have to do is to develop understanding, um, And because I'll be the first to admit, like, I don't necessarily understand how there is um, alignment between supporting the current administration's policies and being a social worker. Like that's challenging for me. And I think I have to admit that I would have to start with understanding and just kind of being present uh, in that. Marion?
Yes, you know, I just wanted to add to this piece of it is that, you know, also we can't, it's not necessarily always going to be helpful to get into, to reach for understanding. Sometimes the work that we're doing requires action that we know and that we feel aligns with not only our profession, but who we are, our own professional identity. So I would just encourage people because I've had to do this myself specifically. You know, I can get with them in the future if I want to understand how they could,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
But in the present, I need to identify others who either are like-minded or are open to listening to what you know, this is the issue that's present. How can we coalesce and mutually support each other to get action or activity
Yeah.
moving this in a better direction? So sometimes I think, you know, we as social workers, and again, it can be part of our skill in being patient and providing space and listening. But we also need to have that internal kind of monitor that says, okay, ding ding, uh, uh, time's up,
Yeah.
right? And if these individuals, these social worker colleagues, peers, are not where I am, then the work that we do together may be the work that we do together. But if we're talking about change, I've got to find some other people to get involved with. And sometimes that may mean coming outside of the organization's list of kind of quote unquote social activities or social involvement and find some that align better with where I'm hoping to go and to be as a professional. I can
Absolutely.
understand them at a different time and place sometimes, but otherwise I need to sometimes keep it moving. And it's
Yep.
okay.
Yep. Absolutely. Erica?
This idea of, you know, how can you be a social worker and that be congruent with more conservative, for lack of a better way of saying that, values, is an interesting question. Um, Living in South Dakota, that is a very common um, conundrum, and actually working on a documentary exploring that a little bit. And you know, it's not like a scientific study or anything like that, but kind of a theme that at least I've observed is that a lot of social workers with those mindsets oftentimes do more micro work. They're oftentimes private practice therapists who um, take cash or private insurance, and so they only have select patients. And quite honestly, a lot of them got social work degrees because they could bill certain insurances more than others than if they got a counseling degree.
Mm.
So it's trying to navigate that sometimes, because uh, I don't know if they jumped into social work necessarily always with this social justice mindset. And it kind of talks about that in that book, Unfaithful Angels. And it's just very interesting. Like in our state, in our NISW chapter in particular, we have a section of social workers where we really try to engage, but they get very frustrated because they feel that social work is not political. And whenever we try to talk about like passing bills or whatnot, they get very upset. And it's trying to figure out how do you extend the olive branch to those folks, and it's just very fascinating. I don't know if I'm going anywhere with sharing that, but I'm sure.
Yeah. I appreciate that. Yeah. And I see that we are getting really close on time. So again, I wanted to thank you all for showing up this afternoon. I have loved the conversation. I will make sure to share my slides with NASW and they can distribute those if you all are interested in that. Also check out some of the resources and references. And I see that Danielle posted the evaluation um, in the chat, so make sure that you click on that to get your CE for today. And then also, I'd highly recommend checking out the calendar for NASW Michigan. There are a lot of free CE opportunities that are on there, and kind of going into this idea of mutual aid, right? Like providing service, which is one of our core values, and sharing knowledge is part of that. At least that's how I operationalize it, and that's why I like doing CE events like this and having the opportunity to have these kinds of discussions. So I look forward to continuing these conversations with you all in other spaces. Um, so feel free to reach out. Um, Otherwise, I hope you all have a good afternoon and a good weekend, and I will see you all next time.